Well, hello again. Welcome to Horror in Detail. Today we are going to share Wendigo and Skinwalker encounter stories. First story: The Howls of a Blind Wendigo. Imagery for the story: truck driver with a mid-sized company, my assigned truck being a long-nosed Peterbilt with one of those driver-controlled searchlights mounted just above the mirror. I've been driving for 5 years, have gone 650,000 miles and somehow managed not to lose my mind in the process. Come one autumn day about a year back, and I was given the delivery that would bring me an experience I hadn't thought would exist except in my worst nightmares. I had received a message on my truck's computer to make a multi-stop run from Indianapolis to Duluth, then from Duluth to a town called Ely. The run to Duluth had been no problem with a 2-day trip. The run from Duluth to Ely seemed a bit trickier, what with the quickest, legal, run being Minnesota Route 1 from Minnesota 61. It was that certain kind of night where everything was shrouded in darkness. The moon was covered by the clouds and a winter storm was on the horizon, making the air even colder than it already was. I figured that I deserved a nice warm cup of coffee after this drive was over. The drive along 61 was uneventful with only a couple of cars and semi-tractors on the road this late into the night. The radio was calling for a light forecast of hazy rain with a relatively thick fog until that afternoon. All the more reason to get this run finished, I supposed. Sometime along Route 1, my trailer began shaking violently with my truck having difficulty in pulling it. Pulling along a flat line of grass, I noticed one of my tires on my trailer had ruptured. Annoyed with losing time, I pulled into a small grove and parked along a worn dirt path facing the highway. To rear of my tractor was a thick bundle of northern forest that likely hadn't seen human tracks in decades. A quiet wind washed over me as I relayed a breakdown message to my company, receiving another that a tow wouldn't be out until the morning. No problem. I've got a fridge full of food and a satellite for TV. Several hours passed as I laid in my bed. A windstorm woke me up as I tossed and turned to gain my bearings. That wasn't wind I was hearing. The best I can describe it is the sound of metal sliding against metal, like the brakes of a locomotive. The noise was some distance away, roughly a quarter mile to the rear if I had to guess. The noise was getting closer, more to the left of my truck, somewhat about the front of the trailer. I could hear what sounded like tapping fingers or claws against my trailer. The sound of hoofsteps marching through the thick grass alerted me to the fact that this may be just a harmless animal, wishing to take a look and ease my nerves. I slid the curtains open and came face to back with the stuff of nightmares. The antlers reached to the top of my truck's windows. The creature brandishing them was a hunched-over, bipedal mass of skin and bones with the skull of some deer or elk. Fearfully, I turned the searchlights on to get a better look at the thing in question and to hopefully frighten it off. I wish I hadn't. The light itself hadn't alerted the creature, but me moving myself and the truck had set it into a hunched-over stance, keeping an ear open for some form of prey, I presumed. I noticed empty eye sockets that seemed to go on forever that slotted into the ancient skull of some sort of deer or elk. I was afraid of turning the key in fear of rousing this monster's predatory hunger. It looked near starvation, as though it had been years since it last ate. I sat and waited. It was near 5 o'clock. The tow wouldn't come to work until around 7. A buck, roughly a 10-pointer, meandered into the field before spotting the creature in question. This thing has to have some great hearing since it didn't see the deer wander across its sight lines. It was blind, had to have been. Moments passed before the buck began chomping on berries from a nearby bush. The blind monster heard the sounds and pounced. From 15 feet it took all but 5 seconds for the buck to have been gutted and torn apart. The creature didn't seem to want the buck for food, more or less rather for twisted enjoyment. I had seen enough. Turning the engine over, the monster looked in my general direction and roared threateningly as it rushed to make contact with my truck. I managed to pull forward just enough that it made contact with the trailer instead. The trailer lifted up a few inches as the sound of bending metal embedded itself into my ears. Shifting from third to fifth and continuing to 10, the creature was still in chase until I crossed over a hill. Looking back through my mirrors, the monster was gone. I pulled off and got out. The sounds of scraping metal were far and away, replaced by the quiet rustling of trees. I continued driving again until I came upon an area that trucks could park in, well-lit and asphalt, much better and safer than the grove from earlier. Afternoon came, and I went to inspect the damage from last night's incident done to my trailer. Claw marks etched into the driver's side of the trailer went on for the whole length of 53 feet. A massive dent roughly 2 feet from the truck itself reminded me that I wasn't just fortunate to be alive, I was damn lucky. The delivery went off without complication since the tow only had to change a tire, and I went home several days later, the creature still on my mind. I went online to figure out, bluntly, whatever the hell it was. The skull of a deer and possible bloodlust for people brought me to several conclusions, the most effective that I was either losing my mind in the mountains or that I had come face to face with an American Indian folklore nightmare known as the Wendigo. Essentially what becomes of you if you cannibalize on human flesh. I've no plans on stopping on Route 1 overnight again. Talks with the locals included everything from ghosts to, of course, that same Wendigo I had encountered. I went on Route 1 again last week. The sounds of scraping metal were heard once more, and I saw a shadow move across the forest at a blistering speed. I noticed that it didn't get too close this time, just close enough to see the fog from its breath. It knows who I am. It's just waiting for me to let down my guard. Second story. Some advice from a professional monster hunter. It sounds cliché horribly, but my family has been hunting the things that humanity is born to fear for over 10 generations. In this world, just like any other, there are monsters that lurk in the darkest corners of the world. These monsters live in the jungles, deep underground, the Arctic, the deep sea, the mountains, the forests, and even cities. Where these monsters come from, some were summoned by the occult and dark magic. Some were naturally born of this earth, and some don't even come from our plane of reality. Over my lifetime, hunting the leviathans and behemoths of the world, I've traveled all over the globe, encountering and killing the things that make your skin crawl. Honestly, most people in my line of work don't make it this far. I'm currently 30 years old, but I started hunting back when I was 23. And since I am based in the USA, and my specialty is hunting different monsters, and sometimes malevolent corporeal and non-terrestrial entities and beings, and some of those beings don't even come from our planet or universe. I hunted my first monster/entity, like I said, when I was 23. I had hunted regular cryptids and monsters before, but this hunt was unlike any other I had in the past. I regularly work with my brother, Dennis, since this monster hunting is more of a family business. At least in my area, we officially belong to a much larger network. This job is extremely dangerous, and I strongly advise you against hunting monsters, even if you can find them. Dennis called me, letting me know about monster activity in the Great Lakes area. Dennis is a monster hunter as well, but he also finds cases for me. Apparently, there were several moose carcasses discovered, but they weren't just mutilated. One carcass had been found, ripped to shreds and hanging 20 feet off of a tree. All the other carcasses were discovered in the span of 1 week, all in a similar manner. Before actually going to the area, I did some investigating online. Over the past 2 years, 10 campers, hunters, and hikers had gone missing. No bodies, no blood trails, not a trace. But what intrigued me was that hunters had gone missing. The hunters, upon further investigation, were mostly big game hunters, which meant that they had big guns, used for big deer and elk. This meant that whatever was killing people was big and durable enough to survive high-caliber ammunition, and also stealthy enough to sneak up on hunters unnoticed. After gathering enough intel, I grabbed my weapons, got in my car, and headed to the forest the deaths were reported. If I forgot to mention, I carry a lot of weapons in all my hunts. Depending on the situation, I carry an arsenal of melee weapons, such as combat tomahawks, bowie knives, and machetes. And on that hunt, I also carried my 50 cal tactical sniper rifle and a special weapon. That special weapon was an 80-pound pistol crossbow with modified crossbow bolts. The crossbow bolts we dipped in white ash, blessed by a shaman, and I duct-taped a mini Molotov cocktail I made using a test tube and gasoline to the bolts. And I also carried my bowie knife, which was the size of a small chihuahua. And so, I arrived at the location. The road to the location was surrounded on both sides by thick trees, and beside the location was a small town with a population of less than 400. I parked in front of a densely forested trail, and I began hiking the trail, looking up. Since the moose remains were so high up in the tree, they were never removed. About 2 miles deep into the forested trail, I hadn't seen a single person, but what I had seen were some moose remains in the tree. They were way too high for me to reach or knock down, so I knocked the moose remains off of the tree by shooting them down with my crossbow, using some of my regular arrows. Once the remains were down on the ground, I inspected them. To my surprise, there were no bite marks on the creature, but there were what appeared to be tentacle scratches. It looked as if a colossal squid had hit the moose, puncturing the skin and ripping it apart. And strangely enough, there were also teeth marks on the moose carcass, but not normal teeth marks, like bear teeth marks, but like shark bite marks. It was very strange, at the least. That night, I went back into the forest, carrying a deer carcass I would use as bait. I put the deer in a clearing near the spot I found the dead moose, and I hid behind a rock, holding my crossbow, the 50 cal rifle by my side. It wasn't until midnight that I saw the creature responsible for all the deaths in the forest. It was nothing like the regular cryptids I had seen. Almost all of the cryptids I had seen in my lifetime, Wendigo, crawlers, fleshgates, skinwalkers, thing in the deep sea without known names had at least some resemblance to humans, but what came out of the forest that night looked nothing like a human being. The creature was about 15 feet tall and 5 feet wide, but it looked even bigger because of all its appendages. The creature's main body mass was made up of black and rotting flesh that gave off a putrid odor. The creature had several crocodilian heads lacking eyes, all mismatched on its upper body. The creature had legs coming out of one of its mouths, and there were spider-like and clawed legs coming everywhere out of its body, all different sizes and bending awkwardly and with multiple joints. The lower part of the creature was made up of spined tentacles and tendrils, all squirming and wriggling as the creature moved. There were dozens of black eyes dotted over the creature's body, all of them looking in different directions at a time as if they were searching for something. The creature also had a dozen thick tentacles, all of them ending in toothed, leech-like mouths. I almost threw up when I saw the creature, but I managed to hold it back. The creature was nothing I had ever seen before, something my feeble human mind was not ready to comprehend. I silently raised my crossbow, lit the cloth on the Molotov cocktail, and I fired. The arrow hit one of the creature's heads, and the Molotov cocktail on the crossbow bolt exploded into a brilliant blue fireball, covering the creature in flames. I quickly reloaded the crossbow, lit the cloth, and fired a second arrow, this time aiming for center mass. By now, the creature's eyes had spotted me, and it was lumbering towards me at a horrifyingly fast pace. I picked up the 50 caliber. and I fired at the creature. It stopped in its tracks, screeched, but it didn't die. I reloaded and fired again, but the same result came out of it. Afraid I was out of options, I pulled a sawn-off pump-action shotgun, and I ran towards the creature, and I began to slam fire into the creature. I could see the tentacles sever and chunks of flesh getting ripped off of the creature. This shotgun was clearly doing much more mass damage than my other weapons, and I continued to slam fire into the creature until I ran out of ammo. I quickly reached into my pocket and pulled a few shotgun shells, but before I knew it, one of the creature's tentacles had grabbed my leg, and I was being pulled into the air. In an act of desperation, I drew my Bowie knife out of its sheath, and I began viciously slicing at the tentacle holding onto my leg, and by the fifth slash, I had completely severed it. The creature let out another screech as I escaped and ran back to my spot behind the boulder, and I pulled out the last resort I always carried, a giant 2-liter wine bottle filled to the brim with gasoline, topped with a flaming cloth. I threw the giant Molotov cocktail at the already flaming monster charging towards me, and it exploded into a gigantic fireball, completely engulfing the creature in flames. Intending to finally kill it off, I picked up my .50 caliber, and I fired at the creature, severing a huge chunk of flesh. Then I picked up my reloaded shotgun, and I finished the creature off. For good. After the creature was finally nothing more than a burning pile of rotting flesh and tentacles, I began to put out the fire by throwing dirt on it. But to my absolute shock, the corpse slowly dematerialized on its own, and it disappeared, leaving me to stomp out the small fires surrounding the clearing. It was fucking dead, finally. Now here's some advice. 1. Don't try to kill monsters. Your puny .308 won't do shit against godlike entities. 2. If you have no choice and have to fight, use fire. It works better and gives you time to leave as soon as possible. 3. If you see large, extremely and unnaturally mangled corpses of apex predators or large animals, stay away. 4. If you see some crazy shit like this, you're probably already dead. 5. The only feasible way to kill creatures of this magnitude are multiple people and extremely heavy or unconventional firepower. The army could have folded this thing in under a minute, but I'm only one person. 6. If you see any creature unnatural looking, stay the hell away and get out. This isn't a movie. You're going to get gored if you try to pet one of these things. And that was the first time I had ever fought and killed a horror like that monster. But it would not be the last. For only 2 weeks after I had fought that eldritch horror, I hunted something much, much worse. I mentioned how I belong to a network. It's more of an organization, mostly worldwide, full of other monster hunters and various organizations. Third story. If you see a Target store in rural Appalachia, keep driving. One day, while typing away on my computer, I got a call from my sister, Anna, in the middle of the workday. This was unusual because we weren't particularly close and usually only talk a few times a year. From the second I picked up, I knew something was wrong. "Adelia?" she asked, sounding stressed. "Yes," I answered. "What's going on?" "It's our Uncle Jim. He fell again." I sighed. My Uncle Jim and I were very close when I was growing up. He stepped in to help my mom with Anna and I after our father died and was the only father figure I knew. Up until last year, he was very healthy, at least for a 70-something man who'd smoked since he was 14. About a year ago, he fell off a ladder one day while painting his living room and his mobility never fully recovered. He'd fallen earlier in the month and sprained his wrist. He also had his electric shut off a few months back due to forgetting the bill. He seemed to be losing his self-sufficiency bit by bit. "I know you don't want to hear this, but I think it's time we started looking at nursing homes for him," Anna said. I shook my head. No, we can't do that to him. He doesn't want to leave Rex in some dog shelter, and he loves his gardening. He would also hate being stuck in some room all day. Adelia, he wouldn't be stuck in a room all day. They have activities. He could make friends there. No, we'll figure something else out. I cut her off, determined to make her see my point. I care about him too, and I'm not happy about this either, responded Anna. But I'm scared that if we don't do something soon, he's going to end up seriously hurt or worse. What about hiring a home health aide? I asked. I've already looked into that. Pickings are slim around here on his budget, and so far I haven't been able to find anyone. I'll do it, I volunteered without thinking. What? Asked Anna, sounding surprised. I'll move back and be his caretaker. My job's remote, and I can clean out the extra room at his house to stay in. Are you sure? She asked. I know you've been doing really well in Louisville. I love it here, I admitted. But I want to help Jim. It's the right thing to do. He was always there for us when no one else was. I mean, that's great, but aren't you worried about living in the same town as Chase? She asked. I sighed. The protection order's still in effect, and Jim has plenty of guns and a big dog. I think I'll be okay. Well, I gotta get off the phone, but if you're serious about this, I can talk to Jim. I am, I responded. After ending the call, I sat there in shock. I knew I wanted to be there for Jim, but I couldn't believe I was moving back to the small West Virginia town I had to flee just 4 years ago. I spent the next 2 weeks packing my things and tying up the loose ends of my brief stint in the city. I knew I would miss it. While a lot of my friends craved the wide open spaces, farmland, and light traffic of smaller towns, I felt nothing but dread the second I left city limits. I'd enjoyed growing up in the small town, but as I got older, the facade of it being a safe and quiet place began to disappear. Things seemed to get really bad when a local factory closed, leaving many people out of a job. Drug use was also rampant in the area, and an increase in theft and property crimes followed. Small businesses closed due to the lack of income, and it was generally accepted that anyone who didn't move away would likely spend their lives in poverty. The lack of employment wasn't the only reason I left. I was a freshman in high school when I met Chase, who was a senior. I quickly fell for him and moved in with him immediately after graduation. Although he'd been controlling throughout our relationship, I never knew he was capable of violence until his first outburst a few months into us living together. I left a year later. Unfortunately, Chase didn't take the breakup well and immediately began stalking me. I would often notice his car driving past my home and place of employment. He also wrote me unhinged letters accompanied by flowers, sometimes alive, sometimes dead. I went to local police several times for help and was basically laughed off or told this was just a relationship issue that I needed to work out. Chase had a cousin in the police force, which likely didn't help my case. I had few ties to the small town, especially after my mom passed, and decided the most rational option would be to leave. I arrived at Uncle Jim's just a few days after the call from Anna. Anna and her husband stayed for a few hours to help me get settled in. Jim seemed really glad to have me around. As much as I hated to admit it, I could see why Anna was thinking about a nursing home. Jim would insist on doing everything himself, and within the first week there were a few false scares and forgotten pots on the stove. Eventually, he started to feel more comfortable with me helping around the house and seemed to enjoy having more time to just sitting on the porch with Rex. Even though I missed the city, I began to feel somewhat more comfortable at Jim's. I still felt a tad uneasy when I went into town, though, because Chase still lived locally. More than anything, I found myself getting bored. I didn't have any real friends here, and there wasn't much to do. One evening, I found myself taking a drive after Jim went to bed. I just needed to get out of the house for a while. I stayed away from town and was listening to music with my windows down on the back roads. I was actually having a pretty good time until I noticed a truck behind me. I didn't think much of it at first, but they seemed to be gaining on me despite the fact that I was driving well over the speed limit. There weren't any other cars, so I figured they would pass me. They didn't. I glanced up at the rearview mirror and quickly looked back down. The driver was a male around my age. I couldn't see him that well, but he did look a lot like Chase. It was hard to say for certain since I hadn't seen him in years. The truck continued to aggressively follow me. I began panicking, fear welling up into my chest. I reached into my purse for my phone. Damn it, it wasn't there. I remembered putting it on the charger, and I must have forgotten to take it off. I could feel myself start to hyperventilate, but I knew I had to stay in control. Abruptly, and without thinking, I took a sharp right turn onto a single-lane dirt road. Despite it being dark, I turned off my headlights and sped forward. I took a few random turns, one left, one right, then another left. Luckily, I didn't see any sign of the truck once I turned off. I began to wonder if I overreacted. Maybe it wasn't Chase after all. Either way, the driver still seemed questionable. Why tailgate someone for so many miles out in the middle of nowhere when you could easily pass? I quickly realized that I didn't know where I was. Great. Now I was lost at night with no phone. I tried my best to navigate my way home, but nothing was looking familiar. Just as I was losing hope, I saw a light ahead. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. The familiar bright red sign of Target. But how? I glanced around and didn't see anything nearby. No other stores, homes, or businesses. I knew from experience that Target stores are never in small towns. Certainly not on the outskirts of a small, impoverished town in West Virginia. I slowly pulled into the parking lot. I didn't see any other cars there. It was pretty late, so maybe they were closed. I decided to walk up and see. I missed shopping at Target while living in Louisville, and it would be nice to be able to get some things to make my room and office at Jim's feel more like home. To my surprise, the store was open. The glass doors opened as I approached. I grabbed a cart, excited to start shopping. I started in the cosmetics aisle, grabbing a few facial creams. I quickly noticed something unusual. There seemed to be no one else in the store. I didn't see any customers or employees. I figured maybe they were just short-staffed and not busy this time of night. I also noticed there was no music playing overhead. The only sound I could hear was the light buzzing of the fluorescent lights. I continued to walk through the aisles and made my way to home decor. I saw a cute storage ottoman that would be a great fit for my room. When I picked up the box, I noticed it was covered in a thick layer of dust. I coughed. I glanced around and noticed a few items similarly covered. I continued with my shopping, albeit slightly annoyed at the dust. I was looking at some containers on a lower shelf when I noticed black shoe prints on the ground. This place wasn't very clean for a Target, but I shrugged it off. I would need to get used to things being different here. I remembered that Jim had mentioned needing some more ibuprofen, so I decided to take a look at the medical aisle. I was grabbing a box of ibuprofen when I noticed a row of nebulizers. While I wasn't surprised to see this in the medical aisle, I was shocked at how many types they had and how much of the shelving they took up. The first few rows consisted of ones I'd seen before when my mom was in the hospital. But as I glanced down, I noticed more unusual-looking medical devices. They looked vaguely familiar, like maybe I'd seen them before in an antique store. Some looked brand new, while others were rusted and covered in dust. I also noticed a bunch of oxygen tanks further down the aisle. Like the nebulizers, some looked brand new, while others looked like they were decades old and worn. Nothing in here made sense. Why would a Target have all of these oxygen tanks and vintage medical supplies? Was it even safe to store the oxygen like this? I paused and picked one of the older-looking breathing machines up. As I tilted it, a black liquid spilled out. I dropped it and wiped my hand on my pants, cussing to myself. I started getting a bad feeling. I was in a strangely placed Target on the outskirts of my hometown that appeared to have no one else in it, but did stock strange items that don't belong in Target. I started to wonder if maybe the store was abandoned. I contemplated abandoning my cart and leaving the store, but as dumb as it sounds, I hadn't been able to buy anything special for myself in a long time, and I was really hoping to get what I came in for. I made my way up to the front and noticed there were no self-checkouts. I glanced around looking for an open checkout. The lights on each line were off, and I didn't see any workers. "Hello," I called out hesitantly. There was no response. I was starting to walk back towards the doors when I noticed a worker. His back was turned, but I recognized the red shirt. "Hey," I called out. He didn't answer and continued walking away. Feeling frustrated, I decided to head home. As I tried to leave, the glass doors stood still. I tried pulling them apart, but they wouldn't budge. My heart began to pound. I felt trapped, like a caged animal. I was stuck, alone, in this weird store that defied all common sense. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a clock. It was 10 p.m. on the dot. I started to reason with myself. Yes, the store's a little off compared to the Targets where I was from, but the doors are probably only locked because they close at 10, and maybe the employee was just wearing AirPods or had hearing issues. I started walking back through the store and saw the employee. His back was turned again, and he was walking ahead of me. I continued to try to call out to him with no response. Finally, I got close enough and tapped him on the shoulder. He turned his head to reveal a blank canvas of skin with no facial features present. This person, or whatever it was, has no eyes, mouth, or nose. I jumped back in horror and ran. I ran further into the store, not stopping to look back. I couldn't believe how big the store was. I'd been running for so long without hitting a wall or seeing another exit, and the store appeared to go on indefinitely. I noticed that the light was becoming dimmer and dimmer as I went forward. It was almost in the dark by the time I stopped running. The setup and merchandise of the store was becoming less and less familiar as I went further in. The aisles in the darker section of the store were filled with bags of coal, rusty-looking gas masks, and a variety of tools that looked decades old. I noticed that I was hearing faint noise, footsteps, and hushed voices. I glanced around to see that there were other people in the store. At first, I felt relieved, especially when I saw they had faces, unlike the employee. But then I noticed something was off. All of the people were covered head to toe in a sort of black dust. They were also dressed in clothing that looked over 50 years old. Some wore gas masks, others didn't. A few had headlamps. I knew coal mining was a big industry in West Virginia, but nothing here looked modern. One of the men turned to look at me. His eyes widened, and he began sprinting towards me, steel pick in hand. I ran but tripped, and he quickly caught up to me. He was hovering over me, and I was certain the pick would soon be crashing into my skull when another man pushed him away, and I took off. At this point, I was so deep in the store that it was pitch black. I saw people walking around, but tried to avoid being noticed. I saw a faint light towards the back of the store. It was a cave with people surrounding it. The entrance glowed orange like a fire was lit. I hid behind a shelf and tried to figure out what they were looking at. Someone emerged from the cave, and an empty mine cart followed in tow. A man walked up to it and began emptying huge bags into it, the contents of which crashed against the walls of the trolley. I could see the outline of the last few bits coming out of the bag. Bones. I stood there frozen in terrified silence watching this strange ritual play out. Little did I know, it would only get stranger. I heard loud footsteps and the floor vibrated beneath my feet. I could see a shadow from within the cave. It appeared to be hunched over, as if it was too tall to stand up straight in the cave. As the figure emerged, I could see it was humanoid in shape and stature, but had a generous display of antlers. I remember Jim telling us kids legends about Wendigos in the area. He claimed to have encountered one while hunting. I didn't believe him at the time, especially with his track record of telling tall tales, but there was nothing else that could describe what I was seeing. The Wendigo let out what I can only describe as a demonic screech. It spoke in a low, distorted voice. "I need more," it yelled. The man standing next to the trolley said something in a quiet voice that I couldn't make out. The Wendigo lowered its head, so it was eye level with the people standing there, and snarled, causing a few of them to jump back. It then retreated back into the cave. "What the hell?" I whispered. Just then, a hand covered my mouth. I turned around and noticed it was the same man who pushed the guy who attacked me earlier. His skin was hot to the touch, almost burning my lips. I tried to scream, but he tightened his hand around my mouth. He whispered to me, "You need to stay quiet or you're going to end up in that mine cart. If you keep quiet, I'll help you get out." Apprehensive, I nodded. He took his hand off. He glanced around and motioned for me to follow him. He pulled me off into an aisle as there were a lot of people walking back from the cave. "We need to give everyone a few minutes to clear out before looking for the way out," he said. "There's a janitor's closet up front. We need to make a beeline for it and stay as quiet as possible. Got that?" I nodded. We were able to get into the closet safely. The man lit up some archaic-looking lantern, and I was able to see his face for that first time. He looked to be late 20s and was covered in soot like the others. Despite his gritty appearance, he had kind-looking eyes. What is this place?" I asked, stammering. The man chuckled. "It's whatever you want it to be. For some it's a bar, others a casino. Hell, I've even seen it be a strip club." I gave him a confused look. "Look, I don't have time to go into all the fairy tales and lore behind this place, but it's basically the perfect storm of cryptids and angry human spirits," he explained. "West Virginia hasn't treated its people so well for a long time and hasn't treated the environment much better. When you have hundreds of people dying an early and ugly death because of unsafe working conditions, their spirits tend to stick around. The cryptids weren't happy with their land being invaded either, so we teamed up, and here we are. The cryptids require so many human sacrifices each year in order to maintain their alliance with the human spirits. The human spirits are happy to pitch in because most here are full of rage and want revenge on the people living now for enjoying the fruits of their labor." I stared at him. "My name's Andy, but the way," he said casually. "So this place is like a live trap for humans?" I asked. Andy nodded. "Pretty much. People who happen to pass by see something that would draw them in, like moths to a porch light." I felt embarrassed. I fell for thinking a target would be in the middle of nowhere. "Were you a coal miner?" I asked, trying to wrap my head around this. Andy nodded. "Yeah, I died way before you were ever born." "Was it a collapse?" I asked. "No, it was lung complication," he responded. "Wait, so if all the human spirits here are angry and need sacrifices, why are you helping me?" I asked. Andy shrugged. "It all starting to lose its luster for me. Don't get me wrong. I'm angry I died so young, especially because my daughter wasn't even 2 yet. But making other people suffer a worse fate isn't gonna change how my life turned out. When it's just drunken assholes walking in here hoping to cheat on their wife, I don't feel so bad, but you look like you have your whole life ahead of you." Andy and I talked for a while, waiting for the others to clear out. Andy told me that once daylight hits, the target will disappear. If I'm not on the outside, I'll be stuck hiding in here until I'm caught and sacrificed. At some point in the night, I heard a distant scream. It was definitely a human being killed. I could tell Andy tried his best to act like he didn't hear it and to distract me, but I knew what I heard. About an hour after we got to the closet, Andy opened the door and looked around. "It looks like the coast is clear," he said, smiling. "But where's the way out?" The door was locked. You have to go out the same way you came in. The laws of reality still apply to the door you entered through. So if it was locked, we need to break it or pry it open. Okay, I answered hesitantly. Andy and I carefully began making our way to the front of the store. Andy grabbed a crowbar off a nearby shelf. Once we were up front, he began prying the door open. The sound of a security system blared the second it opened. Before I could leave the store, someone grabbed me from behind. It was one of the many human spirits. They all came running when they heard the security system. They began to surround me. The one who grabbed me, a large, gruff-looking man wearing overalls and covered in soot, began to strangle me. I tried to fight myself free, but it was no use. I felt the breath leaving my lungs and began to feel dizzy. Just as I was accepting my fate, a familiar face emerged from the crowd. Andy hit the man holding me in the face with the crowbar, bloodying his mouth, then yanked me towards the door. The others attempted to grab me and Andy. One tried to grab my arm, and I clawed and bit him until he let go. As Andy and I got closer to the slightly open door, the spirits began pushing us up against the glass. It felt like I was being crushed. Andy managed to make enough room to move me closer to the door. The crowbar had fallen during the struggle, and I couldn't reach it. I was going to be crushed if I didn't get this door open. I pulled at it for what felt like forever, my fingernails breaking off and bleeding in the process. Then it finally opened enough for me to skip out, and I ran out. I turned back to see the others were angrily turning on Andy. "Adelia, take this and give it to my daughter," he yelled and tossed a worn envelope out the door. I inched back towards him. "I'm gonna help you, Andy," I said. "No," he screamed. "Just make sure my daughter gets the envelope." I hesitated, then grabbed it and ran to my car. I peeled out of there and was quickly back on the road. I was shaking and hyperventilating the entire drive. It was daybreak by the time I made my way home. Still in the driveway, I looked at the envelope. It was heavy. The outside had a name. The ink was so faded I could barely see it. "Josie Reyes," I read. On the inside there was an old-looking watch. I looked it over for a few minutes. Just then there was a tap on my window. I jumped. It was Jim. "Good God, Jim, you scared me," I gasped as I got out of the car. He looked concerned. "Where were you? You look like hell." I shook my head. "It's a long story. I went shopping, but I got lost." "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said. "I saw something, that's for sure." Jim gave me a knowing look. "You know, I've seen a lot living here all these years. I was kind of glad when you moved away, thinking maybe you'd be spared some of the strangeness that comes along with living here. But there's more good here than bad. There's so many good people around here that would literally give you the shirt off their back. I guess what I'm trying to say is when a beautiful landscape and caring, hard-working people are exploited year after year, things start getting weird. The politicians who line their pockets may not be keeping score, but Mother Nature is supernatural forces too." I nodded. "Jim, do you know someone named Josie Reyes?" I asked. "Yeah, she plays poker here every Saturday," he responded, looking curious. "I have something I need you to give her." I told him. Fourth story. I was saved from a skinwalker. For about a year and a half, I 22 dated my ex 23 who was Native American, specifically Navajo. Our relationship got serious enough that we introduced each other to our parents. He and his family lived close to our college, so I would go over there quite frequently for dinner or just to visit. During spring break, his parents invited me to come with them to a log cabin they and their extended family had rented for a weekend. I accepted and honestly got kind of excited as I felt like my BF and I were moving up in our relationship. I also could count the number of family vacations I had taken growing up on one hand, so there was that. The night before we drove to the cabin, my BF's parents invited me over for dinner, and after they sat me down to talk to me about the next couple days, I already knew my BF's grandparents were extremely in touch with Navajo traditions and could be harsh to certain people they saw as outsiders. They basically explained that they may not accept me immediately and that they apologized if at any point they offended me. I thought about what they said the entire drive to the cabin, and it honestly only made me even more nervous the closer we got to our destination. Meeting a boyfriend's family for the first time was stressful enough, but adding on the fact we were the same gender and that his family may view me as an outsider made my chest unbearably tight. As we drove up to the cabin, immediately we saw that there was a group standing outside of it. My BF's dad parked the car. He and his wife jumped out to run over to the crowd to see what the issue was. The yelling was so loud you could hear it almost clearly, despite us still being in the car. I asked my BF who the people were, and he said they were all different family members, and that a serious argument must have broken out. We got out of the car and walked around to the front of it so we could see what was going on. It looked like it was about 9 people yelling at one guy. The guy's had his back to us, but I remember his bizarre way of standing. It's hard to describe, but if I had to give a comparison, it would be Mr. Crocker from Fairly Odd Parents. The argument was so heated it looked like nearly everyone was ready to start throwing punches. Finally, the guy with his back to us yelled something before turning and walking in our direction. I thought he was walking directly towards us, but then I realized he was on the path to walking past us. As he walked by me, I remember he looked at me really quick, and we made eye contact. His hair was long and shaggy and came down over his face, but I could still see his eyes. They looked immensely glazed over, like the guy was beyond high. Despite nothing technically being off about him, it just felt like I had looked into the eyes of a mannequin or something. Getting over my uneasiness, I noticed the guy hadn't walked to a car, but instead had continued to walk until he walked into the woods. I turned to my BF and asked where he was going and who that was, and he said that he was pretty sure it was one of his uncles, but he hadn't seen him since he was a kid. We both assumed the guy had maybe went to blow off some steam or walk off a high. My boyfriend's parents came back and said everything was fine now, and that we could take our bags out the car to head inside. Log cabin was honestly an understatement. The house they had rented out for weekend was massive. It had enough rooms where everyone's personnel family had their own rooms. I was beyond shocked to learn that my BF's parents had gotten us our own room, although it was the smallest. We settled down, and then I got to go around and meet my boyfriend's family. Unexpectedly, everyone was beyond nice. I kind of felt like I'd be treated like an outsider given how traditional my BF had said his extended family was, but nearly everyone I met greeted me with a giant hug and warming smile. I guess the 2 exceptions were my BF's grandparents. Both seemed very contained and had this very serious look on their faces. As I approached them to introduce myself to them, they both looked me over a couple of times before moving. Soon they both stood and gave me a very strong-handed handshake and pat on the shoulder. It wasn't a dream-come-true loving welcome, but it was at least a gesture of acceptance. As the night went on, everyone in the house talked, drank, ate, and even had a period where one family member brought a guitar out and we all drunkenly sung covers of popular songs. I had an amazing time, and it was defiantly a night I wouldn't forget. I do, however, remember this tense feeling that was with me the entire night. Like something was around me, but that I couldn't see. The night flew by, and before long it was sometime after 1 a.m., and everyone was ready to go to bed. Before anyone made their way to the room for the night, my BF's grandfather called everyone into the living room for a family meeting. I figured I was a guest, so that included me, but before I was able to grab a seat, several male family members told me I wasn't allowed to be here for this, and that I had to go upstairs. I was kind of disheartened by this, but I made my way up to my room. To be fair, I wasn't alone, as the Caucasian wife of some member of the family was also not allowed to sit in on the meeting. I went upstairs, showered, and went to my room to mess around on my phone until my boyfriend came upstairs. While I waited, I got a sudden surge of anxiety. I don't know where it came from, but my heart just started racing, and it felt like I was about to cry. It lasted for only a minute or so, but freaked me out big time. After it ended, I sat there confused and slightly shaking. My BF walked in, and seeing him settled me down. I didn't feel the need to mention it to him, as he'd defiantly laugh at me. He showered. We talked for a bit about the day. We did what a couple tends to do when in bed at night, then we both went to sleep. That night I shot up out of my sleep. I wasn't having a nightmare. I wasn't even having a dream. Suddenly I was awake and vaulted out of bed. Standing there, I was confused as hell as to why my body had jolted itself awake. I thought maybe my BF had kicked the shit out of me or suddenly snatched all the covers, but when I looked down at him, he was calmly snoring with my side of the covers thrown over him from me vaulting awake. I looked at the clock and it read 4:10. I was kind of freaked out by my weird wake-up, but I realized I had to pee, so I threw on my t-shirt and shorts and left our room to make my way to the bathroom at the end of the hall. After doing my business, I walked out of the bathroom and into the hallway. The bathroom was at the end of the hallway and sat next to a window. I stopped at the window to take in the nighttime scenery. I looked at the moon casting light over the family's parked cars. What stole my attention away from the cars was a figure moving among the crowd of vehicles. I couldn't tell what it was, but I just watched as it walked up and down the rows of cars. I figured it was someone maybe looking for their car in the darkness of the night, but as my eyes adjusted, the figure clearly wasn't walking like a person. It looked like a black dog or wolf or something four-legged. We were in a heavily wooded area, so I figured it wasn't abnormal for wildlife to wander close to the house. But then the figure stood up. It didn't stand, wobble around, then plant its front legs on the ground. It stood and continued moving through the rows of cars. I watched as the thing walked with a stiff gait around the vehicles before it just stopped to face the house. The darkness seemed to coat the creature, as I couldn't make out any of its features other than its outline. Then it simply looked up at me. Not in the sky or up at the house, but at me. I couldn't see its face, but I knew it was looking at me directly. From its dark form, I saw two small white dots on its head. Just two pinpoint-like dots that stared at me from outside. I don't know how long we stared at each other, but what I do know was that before I knew it, I was walking downstairs into the front door. I just moved, no reason or wanted, but my body was suddenly in motion. As I unlocked the front door, an iron-like hand grabbed my wrist so hard it hurt. I looked over and saw my BF's granddad standing there staring at me with a look that I'll never forget. He didn't say anything. He just relocked the door and turned me to face him. I saw him place something against the door before he pulled out something from his pocket. With a light, he lit it and circled it around my head, saying something under his breath. I remember being utterly confused, but just completely submissive to whatever was going on. As he finished, he used his fingers to put out whatever he lit and told me to go back upstairs. Slowly, I moved back towards the stairs, but as I turned around, I saw him pick up what I realized was a shotgun from off the doorframe. I walked upstairs and stopped before entering my room. I looked at the window and didn't even have to walk over to it to know that that thing was still out there. I laid back in bed, and after about 30 minutes of ceiling watching, I went back to sleep. It was easily the worst sleep I'd ever gotten. I had what felt like 24 hours worth of nightmares that was just me running from something. I was running in slow motion and could hear something fast running after me. Right as I heard it get to me, the dream would restart. I woke up later that morning around 10 a.m. or so and saw my BF was covered in sweat as he slept. He never sweated while he slept, and the room was a cool 64 degrees, so I found it disturbing. I literally had to shake him for about 5 minutes before he woke up. At first, he just dreamily stared straight ahead before he registered I was looking over him. I can honestly tell you that my BF is a part of our college's ROTC program, and he is used to waking up early. 99% of the time, he would wake up 2 hours before me when he slept over. Not to mention in the rare cases that he did sleep longer than me, he would snap awake whenever I touched him. He lazily got dressed before we both went downstairs to find the entire house in a dreamlike state. Everyone moved through the house like zombies and everyone seemed half dead. Before anyone worked on breakfast, my BF's grandfather called for another family meeting. I was still not allowed to listen, but this one lasted much longer than the last. When it was over, my BF and his parents told me we were packing up and leaving. I couldn't argue as everyone in the house simultaneously moved to their rooms to pack up their items. Within an hour, everyone had packed up and placed their belongings in their cars. As we drove away from the massive cabin, I couldn't help but feel like those same small white were watching us from just out of sight. During the ride home, my BF, the car was quiet. When we stopped to get gas, I tried to ask my BF why he had left, but he just looked at me and said it was hard to explain. Even after they dropped me back off at my campus apartment, I wondered if the reason the trip had been canceled was because of the figure I had seen that night as well as the dreamlike state everyone had woken up in. Up until we broke up, I would ask my ex why the trip had been canceled, and he never really gave a direct answer. He'd just say that I wouldn't understand or that it was a family dispute. It wasn't until after we broke up that I saw a documentary on skinwalkers. It made me shudder to think what would have happened if I had opened that door and walked outside. Fifth story. There's something in my grandparents' forest. I don't even know if it's a skinwalker, Wendigo, or any other one of those paranormal creatures. But it for sure is not like what I have heard about. For the past 8 years, I have gone to my grandparents during the summer. The past 6 have had some questionable events. First time I saw it was when I was 7 or 8, almost like it was staring at the house. Their now deceased dog, Flint, was usually the tough type, but in this moment, he looked more scared than I'd ever seen him. He noticed it first, and when I looked there, all my muscles froze. There it was, hunched down beside a rock. It looked like it would be like 12 feet if it stood tall. Ever seen a hounder from Kane Pixel's Backrooms? The body was comparable to that. All of its limbs, however, were bent in odd directions, with the head ticking left and right 180 degrees. Once it backed into the forest, my senses snapped back and I screamed the most blood-curdling I ever have. My brother ran outside, worryingly asking me what's wrong. I could not speak. I just cried and hyperventilated. Eventually, I pointed to the forest. My brother, obviously worried and scared, asked things like, "Is there something in the forest?" with me nodding. We eventually went back inside, and I immediately went to draw a depiction of what I saw. Of course, it was not the best drawing, but it got what I saw down. A disfigured body, oddly bending limbs, and the head twisted down to the neck. My brother seemed to kind of know what it was, or just a concept of it, and we showed it to Grandpa. Of course, Grandma was worried too. It was just Grandpa, Grandma, my brother, and I this summer, but she did not seem to know much about it. Grandpa, though, seemed like he had encountered it multiple times. That night was the most secure night it has been since I have been there. When I tried to sleep, I heard it, a low, curdling screech. It seemed closer to my room, and when I bolted up, it ran away. That's all I remember from that summer. The next encounter happened when I was around 10. This time it was closer and was not as bent down. Clearly it was some sort of demon, but I doubt even hell would have anything like that. This time my dad was also with us, but Grandma and Grandpa went to a town about an hour away to buy groceries and gifts, as my mom's birthday was coming up. Believe it or not, my dad, I do not know how, but I believe him, can speak to God. He can heal people, do things like dodging thrown knives, and much more. He has been with Christ ever since he was about my age, 15. Not even he, however, knew much about it. All he knows is that there's no way it should be here, almost like it has been. It's not like any skinwalker or Wendigo. Back onto the main story, my dad had started a prayer, and the creature started reacting horridly. It let out a huge screech as its body acted against itself, and particles, I do not even know what they had been, started going in and out of it. It was like it was even rejecting the heavens itself, not allowing it to die. It ran to my dad, but the closer he got, the more his body acted out, and it eventually ran away. I have not seen much of it lately, just it lurking in the forest, but I know that one day, something bad with it will happen. They'll update if anything happens during this summer break with an edit to this post. I apologize if this does not provide much context, and it may seem fake, but please believe me. Not many people do, but my brother and I know damn well what we saw. Thanks a lot for watching the video till the end. Subscribe to our channel Horror in Detail. Drop your opinions/suggestions in the comments section, and like the video as it helps with the YouTube algorithm.